Grant Beacon students, before we start reading Arturo, we're going to read this Newsella article, Crossing the Straits, and it gives us a little bit of background information about some of the things that are going to be mentioned in today's Arturo reading. Cuban immigration to the United States began in the late 1800s. It was a time of peace between the two nations, and workers moved freely between Florida and the island. The trade in sugar, coffee, and tobacco was worth a lot of money. Cigar companies started to move their factories to the United States to avoid U.S. import taxes and trade regulations. As Cubans came by the thousands to work in these factories, they settled in Key West and Ybor City. Key West is located at the bottom tip of Florida. Even as these communities grew, Cuban workers continued to shuttle across the Straits of Florida when work was available. At the beginning of the 1900s, between 50,000 and 100,000 Cubans moved between Havana, Tampa, and Key West every year. At the same time, some Cubans fled political oppression. This included revolutionary leader José Martí, who lived in New York. During the Spanish-American War, U.S. forces helped drive the Spanish out of Cuba. Afterward, and through the early 1900s, the United States kept a high level of interest in Cuban affairs, and U.S. businesses increased their investments in Cuban enterprises. Meanwhile, the Cuban government was adopting increasingly repressive laws. In the 1950s, the number of refugees grew as Cubans fled the harsh rule of dictator Fulgencio Batista. In January 1959, Fidel Castro took control of Cuba. A new era of communism began as Castro improved health care and education while taking people's freedoms away. This started a wave of mass immigration from Cuba to the U.S. More than 1 million Cubans would make their way to the U.S., and thousands more would try and fail. Once the new Cuban government allied itself with the Soviet Union, the U.S. and Cuba became open enemies. The Soviet Union was a huge communist country stretching across Europe and Asia. Through the years, as relations between the countries improved or worsened, the door of immigration would open and close. As a result, Cubans arrived in the U.S. in several phases, each of which had a different reception. The first Cubans to flee were the wealthiest. They were mostly rich professionals and members of the Batista government. More than 200,000 of these golden exiles had left Cuba for the U.S. by 1962, when flights between the two countries were suspended. Between 1965 and 1973, a small number of flights were allowed. During this time, 300,000 more Cubans seized the opportunity to leave. Many felt that it was only a matter of time before the new government was overthrown and planned to wait in the U.S. for their opportunity to return. The immigrants of these first two phases were welcomed in the U.S. It was the peak of the Cold War, an intense political rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Cuban immigrants were seen by many in the U.S. as refugees fleeing a harsh dictatorship. The U.S. government opened a Cuban refugee center in Miami and offered medical and financial aid to new arrivals. In 1966, Congress passed the Cuban Adjustment Act. This law allowed any Cuban who had lived in the U.S. for a year to become a permanent resident. This privilege has never been offered to any other immigrant group. The next major wave of immigrants received a very different welcome. In 1980, the Cuban government opened the port city of Mariel. Any Cuban who wanted to leave for the United States was allowed to do so. The Cuban American community got together to help, and within days, hundreds of ships and boats arrived in Mariel. In the 6 months the port remained open, more than 125,000 Cubans were taken to the U.S. These immigrants were much less wealthy than previous generations, and a few thousand had been in prison while in Cuba. As a result, many were discriminated against in the U.S., and thousands were kept in temporary shelters and federal prisons, some for years. Many Cubans took even greater risks in their attempts to leave their country. In the 1980s and 1990s, tens of thousands attempted to flee by sea. They risked death by drowning, exposure, or shark attacks to make the 90-mile crossing. Many rode only on flimsy homemade vessels, including inner tubes and cheap plywood rafts. Hundreds of people died on the journey, and both governments came under global pressure to stop the flotillas. By the end of the 1990s, the two countries agreed that the U.S. would return any boats to Cuba. By the beginning of the 2000s, very few Cubans made it to the United States. Only a major shift in relations between the two countries will result in any more significant Cuban immigration in the future.
Hey, my name is Michelle and I work in the front office at Grant Beacon Middle School, and I am so happy to join today's reading of The Epic Fail of Arturo Zamora. So let's see what's going on this week. When we left the Zamora family last week, they were trying to give their restaurant patrons more attention to combat Wilfredo Pippo's plan to edge them out. Pippo was planning a festival for the community that felt more like a bribe for the city council to vote his way. So let's dive in and see what this week's reading is about. I found Abuela rocking quietly in her recliner. Her face broke out into a smile when she saw me. Arturito, she said, waving me over. She had a book on her lap. I must have caught her in the middle of reading. Poesía, she said. Not poetry again. I wish I could have told her about Wilfredo's festival and about the plans that we had to hand out flyers in protest, but I didn't. Abuela exhaled slowly and deeply, wrinkling her face like she knew my mind was full of crazy thoughts. Abuela knew everything. Lee un poco, Arturito, she said, handing me the book. The name on the worn-out cover was familiar. Jose Marti, the poet Carmen liked and the man Abuelo kept talking about in his letters. Were we related to him, this guy or something? Why is everyone so obsessed with his work? At that, I remembered I hadn't returned Carmen's copy yet. It was still on my desk. I made another mental note to give it back to her soon. The book made a crackling sound when I opened it. The verses were in Spanish, and I had a feeling I was going to end this reading session with a headache. But if it made Abuela happy, it was worth it. The poem began. Yo soy un hombre sincero, de donde crece la palma, y antes de morirme quiero echar mis versos del alma. The lines had something to do with being sincere and growing in a palm tree and dying, and wanting to sing a verse from the alma, which I thought meant soul. I read over to the next part. Yo vengo de todas partes y hacia todas partes voy. Arte soy entre las artes, en los montes, monte soy. I had absolutely no idea what that last part meant. If I flipped to the cover again to give myself a little break, Versos Sencillos was the title. The literal translation was something like easy poems, but trust me, this was not easy. Abuela slid her finger between the pages to open the book and then pointed to the first poem again. She tapped a page until I started reading. Yo soy un hombre sincero, de donde crece la palma, y antes de morirme quiero echar mis versos del alma. I read the opening again and tried harder to translate it. I am a sincere man from where the palm trees grow, and before I die, I want to sing my verses of the soul. Abuela smiled at me. At least that sounded like an actual understandable English. I felt a little proud of myself, so I kept reading. Yo he visto en la noche oscura llover sobre mi cabeza los rayos de lumbre pura de la divina belleza. Okay, this one was much harder. Something about the Dark Knight, but I was pretty sure the poem wasn't about Batman. I felt the pages of Abuela's book between my fingers. Not only did they look and feel like onion skin, they kind of smelled like onion too. Abuela stared at me. She took the book from my hands and put her palm against the back of my neck. Her eyes hid in the folds of her wrinkled lids. She shuffled to the bookshelf and took Marty back into his place. Lo más importante, mi Arturito, es el amor y la fe. Nunca lo olvides. I reached into my pockets and dug so deep my fists nearly busted through the lining. Abuela's hands felt cold and leathery against my neck. Even compared to a few days ago, she looked, I don't know, older. Her movements were so stiff, her gray hair was loose, and she wasn't wearing any makeup. Abuela always wore makeup. She closed her eyes slowly and then opened them again. ¿Has leído las cartas de tu abuelo? She asked. I hadn't read Abuelo's letters in a few days, I told her. She leaned against the bookcase. Estoy un poco cansada, she said, and I helped her to her room. I tucked her into bed and watched as she drifted off to sleep. I wondered how many times in my life Abuela had tucked me in. Probably a million times. I kissed her cheek and whispered goodbye. I left her apartment, still wishing I could have told her about everything that was going on. But how could I? It wouldn't be fair to get her worked up. Abuela reminded me that I had a stack of letters from Abuelo waiting to be read. I wondered if Abuelo ever had to hold in a secret this big from someone he loved. I went to my room to be alone with Abuelo's words. I was eager to hear anything he had to say. 1979. El Valor. Courage. My dear Arturo, sometimes life forces you to make bold decisions. Sometimes those decisions require many sacrifices and choices that will change the course of your journey forever. When Abuela and I left Cuba with our small children, it was no easy thing. We left our homeland, a place we had known all of our lives. I knew this story. Abuelo and Abuela came to the United States from Cuba in 1979. They settled in Miami, where Abuelo found a car mechanic and Abuela cleaned houses. That was how Abuela had met a family called the Merritts. She cleaned their home for years. One day the Merritts threw a party. The caterer canceled at the last minute, so Abuela stepped in and cooked dozens of dishes. The party guests were so impressed. The Merritts asked Abuela to cook for all their fancy parties. Word spread of Abuela's talent, and soon she was cooking for private events all over town. Abuelo and Abuela saved money and bought a small lunchtime restaurant in a part of town where most Cuban immigrants went when they arrived here from the island. The restaurant was called La Ventanita. There was a small window that customers could walk up to and get familiar bites like Cuban sandwiches or a bowl of Abuela's chicken soup with chunky potatoes. It was a comfort food to a whole group of people who longed for a taste of home. Then 19 years ago, when Mr. Merritt passed away, he left Abuela some money to open a restaurant in his neighborhood, and that restaurant became La Cocina de la Isla. Of course, you probably know the history of how we first came to America and how we worked very hard to start our restaurant and build a nice life for our family. Abuela has told me 1,000,000 times, Abuelo, I said to the letter. And surely you know about the dangerous journey we took across this ocean in order to make a new life in America? I wrote a paper about it in class last year. But do you know that this was not the most courageous thing I have ever done? Huh? No, my dear grandson. That distinction belongs to the first time I mustered the courage to tell your grandma, your abuela, how I loved her. How was that more courageous than escaping your country in a rickety boat with small children and risking being eaten by sharks or getting caught and sent to prison? Your abuela was a very tough woman, and very beautiful and talented. I was just a taxi driver who loved to read. What could I possibly offer such an incredibly lady? What if I told her I loved her and she rejected me? My life would be over. I had to find the right moment, the perfect time to show her how much I respected and loved her. I felt a rumbling in my stomach, but I wasn't hungry. It was like a deep fryer was sizzling yuca fries in my guts, and it felt weird and good at the same time. I knew exactly why my stomach felt this way ever since a certain girl with colorful braces had walked into La Cocina 3 weeks ago. I still wasn't sure if it was okay to like Carmen or even if she liked me back, but I had to find out once and for all. My guts depended on it. So I turned back to the letter. So you know what I did? I imagined what Jose Marti must have done when he faced with such a challenge. I wrote a poem for your abuela, telling her how much I loved her. Admittedly, it was the worst poem written in the Spanish language, but still, it gave me the courage to profess my love to her. Letting poetry speak for me was the most unexpected thing I'd ever done. I hope one day you will get to do the unexpected, Arturo. It will surprise you beyond anything you will ever experience. Enjoy courage. It is a wonderful thing to overcome fear. That last line made me feel totally fired up. I folded the letter back into the box, ready to test my courage in more than one way. It was like Abuelo was giving me his mojo through his words. I suddenly felt brave, bold, like a fisherman in a rising storm, taking the massive waves rolling all around him. I wasn't going to get nauseous. No way. I was going to save the restaurant, and I decided I was going to tell Carmen how I actually felt about her. Abuelo and I shared a name. Maybe we shared courage too. Chapter 15. Jose Marti doesn't eat churros. On the morning of the festival, my family gathered in the courtyard. Abuela felt particularly sick, so my mom decided to stay behind with her. You guys will do great. I have faith in you, she said. Echa pa allá. Vanessa arrived with a whole crew of friends wearing bright green t-shirts that said GT. Ollie Rodriguez lifted 3 boxes of flyers at a time and placed them in neat piles in a corner. Ollie was Vanessa's best friend and the nicest girl ever. Simon Oliver, the captain of the school debate team, carefully marked the boxes on a legal pad. His perfectly combed hair, khaki pants, and loafers with no socks made him look 20 years older than he really was. Vanessa's other friends, twins Amanda and Katie, moved swiftly to unfold the table and drape a green cloth over it. Other kids held signs on sticks with different slogans on them. These kids were the real deal at my school. They organized rallies, had students sign all kinds of petitions from making drinking water safer to protecting the Key Largo road rat to planting trees throughout the neighborhood. And their fearless leader, my cousin Vanessa. "Attention Zamora," she said. "This is my environmental group. We call ourselves the Green Teens." I could see Carmen out of the corner of my eye. She seemed mesmerized by the group, a huge grin spread across her face. "We stayed up all night fact-checking and creating the layout for the flyer," Vanessa continued. "If your school asks why they're out of paper supplies, should I tell them to look for the Green Teens?" Martin said, then laughed. "Martin, do you want to tell jokes or do you want to save the restaurant?" Martin actually looked ashamed. It was my turn to laugh. Do you think their plan will act out? We'll see tomorrow.